Imagine, if you will, that the very energy you casually let slip away holds within it the raw material of transformation, not only of the body, but of the soul. There is a secret rhythm hidden deep within the life of man, a pulse that once aligned with grants access to powers long buried beneath the rubble of modern distraction. This is not superstition. This is not asceticism cloaked in outdated morality. No, this is a psychological truth waiting to be reawakened. Most men do not realize they are bleeding out their essence, not from wounds visible to the eye, but from wounds inflicted by habit, by shame, and by ignorance. The seminal force, often dismissed as merely biological, is in fact a psychic reservoir. It is the libido, not merely as Freud defined it, but as I saw it, the raw energy of life itself, capable of becoming anything, destruction or creation, pathology or power. And when it is retained, not repressed but transmuted, it begins to act as a psychic catalyst. In the earliest days of retention, the individual feels first the stirrings of what has been lost, vitality, strength, and even a subtle sharpening of perception. The world appears more vibrant, more real. It is not merely testosterone rising, it is the soul reclaiming its throne. What was once scattered through indulgence begins to gather inwards like an army called back to the castle. The man begins to stand a little straighter, look a little deeper. Women notice. But more importantly, the man begins to notice himself. As the days stretch into weeks, this force seeks direction. It demands expression. Here lies the danger and the opportunity. If he lacks purpose, the energy festers, becomes restlessness, aggression, or delusion. But if he wields it wisely, he steps into the archetype of the magician, the one who takes raw chaos and births meaning. His thoughts become clearer, his intentions sharper, his dreams intensify, not just in sleep, but in waking life. He begins to envision possibilities that were previously obscured by the fog of overindulgence. Now, if the man crosses into the months, he enters a sacred psychological territory few ever dare to tread. He no longer acts from compulsion, but from will. He is no longer reactive to the world, he becomes a force within it. The energy stored begins to spiral upward, touching the higher centers of being. This is not myth. This is individuation in motion. Retention becomes revelation. The ancient alchemists spoke of turning lead into gold. What they spoke of was not chemistry but consciousness. The seminal force, when retained and transmuted, becomes the philosopher's stone. It is the very base material of transformation. The man who learns to command it no longer chases pleasure like a slave. He chooses it, if at all, like a king. But be warned, this path is not linear. It is a labyrinth. Shadows emerge, old traumas, suppressed desires, unresolved archetypes. Retention stirs them from their slumber. And this is the final gift of the practice. It does not let you hide from yourself. It drags you into the depths of your own psyche, forcing confrontation with what you have denied. But only through such confrontation is true integration possible. And only through integration does wholeness arise. So I do not speak of retention as mere technique. I speak of it as initiation, a rite of return to the fullness of the masculine soul. The man who endures its trials does not merely become disciplined. He becomes dangerous, not to others, but to the forces of mediocrity, addiction, and unconscious living. He becomes what the modern world fears most, a man who remembers who he truly is. Deep within every man lies a hidden crucible, a vessel of immense psychic energy that has, for centuries, been squandered, misunderstood, or feared. Seminal retention is not merely the physical act of withholding release. It is the conscious conservation of life force, the very substance from which vitality, will, and creation emerge. In Jungian psychology, this energy is not neutral. It is libido in its truest sense, a dynamic life force that animates all psychic activity. When directed downward, it feeds base pleasures. When transmuted upward, it becomes the fuel for transformation. This is the domain of alchemy, not the literal conversion of metals, but the symbolic transformation of the self. In ancient texts, the alchemists spoke of turning lead into gold. Jung understood this as a metaphor for individuation, the process of turning the unconscious into consciousness, of refining the raw elements of the personality into the wholeness of the self. Seminal energy is the prima materia of the male psyche, raw, potent, and powerful. When retained and raised, it ignites the alchemical fire within. In the early stages of retention, the man notices physical changes, more energy, clearer thinking, heightened awareness. But these are only the surface ripples of a much deeper process. What is truly happening is that energy, once externalized, is now being internalized. It begins to rise, and as it does, it activates dormant psychic structures. Archetypes long buried, the warrior, the magician, the king, begin to stir. The warrior emerges first, not just in aggression, but in discipline. The man begins to assert control over his instincts, not by repression, but by redirection. The retention of semen trains him to endure discomfort, to delay gratification, and to engage life with courage. This archetypal activation is not symbolic, it is somatic. The body remembers, the posture changes, the eyes sharpen, he becomes a man others feel before he speaks. As the process deepens, the magician begins to awaken. This is the archetype of wisdom, transformation, and inner knowledge. Retained energy, now unbound from compulsive release, seeks higher expression. The man becomes more reflective, more introspective. He studies, he contemplates, he begins to see patterns in chaos. This is the first sign of psychological transmutation, the ability to take energy once used for pleasure and channel it into vision, creation, and deep insight. But this journey is not without its trials. The alchemical process requires the confrontation with the Libido, the black stage, the darkness, the shadow. As seminal energy rises, it brings to light all that has been hidden: compulsions, addictions, fears, unresolved wounds. The man must face these without the buffer of numbing indulgence. Retention becomes a mirror. It reveals the truth of who he is beneath the masks, and only by facing that truth can he move forward into the next stage. Eventually, with continued retention and inner work, the king begins to rise. Not a tyrant driven by lust, nor a passive dreamer, but the integrated sovereign, calm, grounded, focused, and generous. His power no longer comes from external conquest, but from inner mastery. He is no longer pulled by impulses, he directs them. He no longer dissipates energy, he radiates it. Others sense his presence, not because he demands attention, but because he commands energy. Seminal retention then becomes far more than a practice of discipline. It becomes the catalyst for psychic evolution. Each stage of retention corresponds to an alchemical stage: the burning of desire, the purification of intent, the solidification of purpose. And through each phase, the man is initiated into deeper layers of himself. The shadow unleashed. How seminal retention confronts the unconscious and heals the inner self. There is a moment, quiet, unannounced, when a man committed to seminal retention begins to feel a different kind of discomfort. It is not merely physical tension or the ache of denied release. It is psychological. Something begins to stir from the depths. Not inspiration, not yet, but unrest. Memories, urges, faces, emotions without names. This is the moment where the real journey begins, not outward but inward. Seminal retention, unlike any other form of discipline, has the strange and terrible power to awaken what the modern man has spent his entire life avoiding: his own unconscious. Jung called this domain the shadow, the hidden, repressed, denied aspects of the psyche that were too uncomfortable, too shameful, or too disruptive to be acknowledged by the conscious mind. These aren't just abstract ideas. They are living energies trapped in the darkness of the psyche, waiting, sometimes for years, to be seen, heard, integrated. The reason so many fail at retention is not due to lack of willpower, but because they are not prepared for what it reveals. The semen, in being held, acts as a psychic mirror. And what it reflects is the man's own fragmentation. Initially, the shadow appears through temptation, not in the form of lust alone, but in its symbolic language: distraction, craving, irritability, self-doubt, shame. The man thinks he is fighting sexual urges, but what he is really encountering is the psychic residue of unmet needs and unresolved wounds. The energy he is holding onto begins to illuminate the very structures he built to avoid pain, coping mechanisms, addictions, false personas. The ego, threatened by the rising power of the unconscious, begins to resist. This is the conflict Jung described, the tension between who we think we are and who we truly are. As retention deepens, these unconscious contents no longer hide in the shadows. They erupt: childhood traumas, repressed anger, feelings of inadequacy. Old heartbreaks, rage, grief, loneliness, all come uninvited. This is not failure, this is initiation. The man begins to see that his previous indulgences were not acts of pleasure, but acts of escape. Sexual release had become a form of anesthesia. Without it, the raw, unfiltered psyche begins to speak. At this point, many retreat. They return to old habits, not out of weakness, but out of fear. But the man who endures, who chooses to stay present with the discomfort, finds something extraordinary. The energy he retains does not destroy him. It reveals him. Each urge, each intrusive thought, each emotional wave becomes a symbol. The urge to relapse is not just lust. It is a cry from the wounded inner child asking to be seen. The flash of rage is not just testosterone. It is the voice of years of submission, finally demanding truth. Jung taught that the goal is not to eliminate the shadow, but to integrate it, to make it conscious. Retention, when approached with this inner lens, becomes a path of deep psychological healing. The man begins to dialogue with his darkness. He understands his patterns, not just intellectually, but viscerally. He feels them arise, he watches them pass, and through this witnessing, he loosens their grip. Seminal energy, previously spilled in unconscious release, now becomes the fire that burns through delusion. This stage of the journey is deeply solitary. No one can walk it for him. The man must sit with himself, without screens, without distractions, without escape. He must learn to transmute, not suppress, his energies. This is the crucible of transformation, where libido, the life force, no longer chases pleasure, but becomes a tool for psychic reintegration. The man begins to embody his full emotional spectrum, no longer running from shame or fear or desire, but standing in the storm of his own humanity. With time, as the unconscious is brought into awareness, a strange peace emerges, not the peace of emptiness, but of wholeness. The man no longer splits his psyche into acceptable and unacceptable parts. He becomes real, grounded, powerful, and aware. The same energy that once drove him toward compulsive behaviors now flows into presence, into clarity, into emotional depth. The shadow does not disappear. It becomes an ally, and the man, no longer at war with himself, begins to act not from reaction, but from alignment. Beyond the flesh, transmuting sexual energy into creative, spiritual, and leadership power, there is a fundamental misunderstanding in modern thought. That sexual energy exists only for pleasure or reproduction. This is a distortion, a forgetting of something ancient. Sexual energy is not merely physical. It is primal life force, raw psychic material, a deep current running through the body and psyche of every man. When this force is not wasted or discharged, but retained and elevated, it begins to seek other expressions. It transforms. This process is not mystical metaphor. It is psychological law. The same energy that fuels lust can become the power behind vision, creation, and spiritual awakening. The key is transmutation. In Jungian terms, libido is not just sexual, it is the psychic energy behind all drives, love, ambition, intellect, imagination, even moral striving. When a man engages in seminal retention, he doesn't just stop releasing, he begins storing. That stored energy accumulates and rises. And as it rises, it demands form. If it is not given an outlet, it turns inward and can become frustration, neurosis, or restlessness. But when it is deliberately channeled into art, thought, leadership, or spiritual practice, it becomes a tool of extraordinary transformation. The creative impulse is one of the most immediate and visible effects of this redirection. A man who retains begins to notice an urge to build, to make music, to write, to craft, to innovate. This is not accidental. Creation is the natural upward movement of life force. What was once spilled in seconds is now rerouted through the nervous system and into the imagination. The mind becomes clearer, but not in a detached sense, in a visionary sense. Ideas come more frequently. Inspiration strikes more often. And more importantly, the energy to execute those ideas is there. Humming beneath the surface, the spiritual dimension too begins to awaken. Not necessarily in a religious sense, but in the form of heightened awareness, sensitivity, and depth of presence. Retention slows time. It deepens perception. The man begins to feel life, not just pass through it. The ordinary becomes symbolic. Dreams become more vivid. Moments of silence begin to reveal insight. This happens because the libido, now unbound from its constant descent into instinct, begins its ascent into meaning. Jung described the upward movement of libido as essential for individuation. It is this climb that brings a man out of his compulsions and into consciousness. But perhaps one of the most overlooked results of transmutation is its effect on leadership. A retained man walks differently. Not because he's trying to impress, but because his energy is contained, concentrated, People feel it. They don't always know why, but they sense it. In a world of scattered attention and diluted presence, someone who has mastered himself stands out. His words carry weight. His silences even more. He no longer needs to dominate to lead. He magnetizes. Leadership, in its true form, is not about control. It is about influence born of alignment. Retention gives rise to this alignment. A man who has harnessed his sexual energy also commands respect, not only from others, but from himself. Hakoing, sir. His confidence is not loud, but rooted. It is not built on validation, but on inner power. He knows he can delay gratification. He knows he can sit with desire and not be overtaken by it. This self-respect radiates. It becomes a model for others, whether he intends it or not. His mere presence becomes a kind of teaching. This is not to say the path is free of struggle. Transmutation requires intent, focus, and daily discipline. The energy must be used, not stored passively. Without purpose, it becomes pressure, but with purpose, it becomes propulsion. The artist creates with fire. The thinker dives into the depths. The leader acts with calm intensity. The seeker ascends. Each path different, yet all fueled by the same retained force, the same ancient current that once drove the body, now driving the soul. Stages of inner ascent. Mapping the psychological and energetic benefits of retention over time. Seminal retention, like any true discipline of the psyche, unfolds in stages, distinct inner seasons that reveal themselves not according to willpower alone, but in response to time, intention, and depth of self-awareness. Unlike shallow habits formed for external validation, retention initiates an inward ascent. What begins as a physical act quickly transforms into an alchemical journey through the layers of one's being. Each stage of time, days, weeks, months, corresponds to a different psychological threshold, each revealing a new aspect of the man beneath the noise, beneath the masks, beneath the conditioning. The energy, when not discharged, does not stay stagnant. It begins to rise, and with that rising comes confrontation, revelation, and transformation. In the first few days, the struggle is immediate and surface level. The man is face to face with habit. His body protests, his mind bargains. Urges, once unconsciously indulged, now demand attention with full force. This is the threshold of awareness. He begins to see how conditioned his impulses are, how frequently he reaches for stimulation not out of desire, but out of discomfort, boredom, or avoidance. Here, retention becomes a mirror, reflecting back his nervous system's dependency on release for regulation. The benefit at this stage is not power, it is clarity. The man starts to distinguish between who he is and what he has been trained to do. He starts to see choice. As he moves into the first week, physiological changes subtly begin. Testosterone regulation shifts, dopamine receptors begin to recalibrate, and the fog that once clouded his focus begins to lift. But underneath these biological shifts is something more subtle. The mind begins to turn inward. Without the constant externalizing of energy, thoughts deepen, reflection increases. This is the stage of mental presence. Ideas that once flickered and vanished begin to root. The man becomes more deliberate. Eye contact strengthens. Posture improves. He begins to inhabit his body more fully. Others may not understand what has changed, but they feel it. He is no longer scattered. He is centered. By the time he reaches 2 to 3 weeks, the emotional body becomes activated. This is where the deeper work begins. Energy now circulating through the system begins to knock on locked doors within the psyche. Old emotions, sadness, anger, grief rise. These are not random. They are layers long buried under habitual release. Here lies the emotional threshold. The man must feel what he once avoided. Retention amplifies presence, and presence amplifies sensation. If he remains with this discomfort, if he allows the emotions to surface without fleeing back into compulsion, something extraordinary happens. He begins to feel whole. Not numb, not neutral, but alive. The emotional bandwidth expands. Crossing into the 1-month territory, the energy reaches the level of identity. The man no longer simply practices retention, he begins to embody it. He thinks differently, he speaks with more weight, he listens more deeply, his decision-making sharpens. This is the beginning of energetic refinement. It's a murder. Seminal energy, retained and unpolluted, begins to be converted, first into magnetism, then into intention. The libido, now sublimated, fuels willpower. He finds himself rising earlier, procrastinating less, choosing challenge over comfort. Relationships change. He no longer seeks approval, he seeks alignment. And because he is no longer fragmented, others begin to respond to his presence without knowing why. He is no longer reacting to life, he is directing it. As weeks turn into months, a different layer opens: spiritual cognition. The man begins to realize that to keep retaining without transmuting leads to stagnation or madness. He must rise with it, he must change, and in that upward motion, he begins to awaken something ancient. Will is not motivation, it is not inspiration. It is not inspiration. It is the quiet, grounded force of presence. It is the ability to act from center rather than reaction. Retention teaches this by necessity. He cannot rely on fleeting highs. He cannot numb discomfort. He must build in a fire. He must build in a fire. And as he does, something inside him begins to shift. His posture changes. His gaze hardens. His voice deepens, not just in tone but in essence. He stops needing to prove. He stops asking for permission. He starts to embody. The man becomes a center of gravity. He speaks, and others listen. He listens, and others speak more, honestly. 3. He enters a room and without effort shifts the energy, not because he performs masculinity, but because he contains it. This containment is not suppression, it is mastery. He has faced his lower nature and not fled. He is burned in the fire and not broken. The boy within him, the one addicted to pleasure, escape, validation, has died a quiet death. And in his place stands a man not created by society, but carved out by choice, pain, and conscious suffering. This is the secret of the Rite. It gives back to the man what culture has stolen, his initiation into power, presence, and purpose. Not through ceremonies or applause, but through his ability to sit with desire, to transmute it, and to stand unmoved. In a world that tells men to chase, to consume, to release, the man who retains becomes a symbol of rebellion. Not against others, but against the unconscious self he used to be. His life becomes the ritual, his discipline the altar, his silence the fire. The fire.